Dear audience, welcome to this brief presentation on accessibility in Dutch archaeological museums for people with hearing or visual impairments. We will share the results of an evaluation that was conducted by Tertipi, a former master student at the Faculty of Archaeology of Leiden University. It was supervised by myself. My name is Monique van der Dries. I am Associate Professor in Archaeological Heritage Management at the Faculty of Archaeology. For her master thesis, Argiro looked at the accessibility of museums for people with visual and hearing impairments. She wanted to know to what extent museums pay attention to accessibility, to what extent provisions are made in exhibitions, how well museum staff is informed and aware of rules and regulations, and if they get any training. In order to gain an understanding of the provisions for accessibility ourselves, and to be able to compose an evaluation framework, we first asked the museum Huis van Hilde, so Hilde's house, if they were willing to offer an internship in which this assessment framework could be developed. Huis van Hilde was very inviting to assess their exhibition and facilities, and we would like to acknowledge this support and thank them very much for this collaboration. Placing themselves in a vulnerable position is highly commendable. Our point of departure regarding accessibility of museums, and therefore the criteria for assessing accessibility, is that museums consider themselves as important cultural institutions that provide learning and social engagement environments. The Dutch Museums Association describes this as museums have considerable social significance. They play an important cultural role as they manage our cultural heritage and exhibit it to a wide audience. They therefore aim to enable a permanent bond of all inhabitants of our country with museum collections, no one excepted. This societal role implies, in our opinion, that they have a moral responsibility to be accessible for all, not just for people that happen to have no physical, sensory or mental impairments. Moreover, national museums and municipal museums are a public resource, usually partly or entirely financed through public funding via taxes. Such public sector organizations need to comply with regulations, so in our case the Dutch Equal Rights Amendment on grounds of disability or chronic illness, our Wet Gelijke Behandeling. This Equal Treatment Act on grounds of disability or chronic illness was first installed in 2003 and an adapted version in 2017. The adapted version now states that discrimination is forbidden and equal participation in social life is the standard, which means that all individuals should be enabled to use public facilities and services autonomously. It implies that public organizations, but also the private sector, should offer provisions unless the costs and efforts will be disproportionate. Facilities and services include public transport, public buildings, websites, mobile apps, etc. And sectors explicitly mentioned are employment, education and housing. Now, we are not the only country with such an act, obviously. It is based on the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities of 2006. And many other countries have signed and implemented the Convention principles as well. By signing this act, we expressed a formal commitment to providing access for all. It's no longer non-committal, it is formal, legal, and a binding obligation. This is now the case in most nation states which are state parties to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. To gain an understanding of the facts and figures we are talking about, I looked for this paper at a number of people in the Netherlands who may not feel equally treated because they are in need of provisions and adapted facilities. Exact numbers are, however, difficult to find. We do not know exactly how many people experience a sensory, physical, or mental impairment. This relates to the various definitions that exist for the word impairment or disability, but also because there is of course no central registration of individuals who experience impairments. Moreover, not everybody experiences or wants to define an impairment or other health issue as a disability. The figures therefore are mere estimates. In the Netherlands, the formal figure is that 1 in every 8 people has an impairment and 1 in every 10 has a considerable or severe mental or physical disability. This is a total of 1.2 million people in the age categories between 12 and 75. Moreover, it is estimated that 350,000 people have a visual impairment and 1.5 million are deaf or have a hearing impairment. Moreover, the Dutch Central Bureau for Statistics made a calculation in 2018 that 5.7% of the population of over 12 years of age need facilities to support mobility, like a walking stick or a wheelchair, and around 150,000 individuals need this wheelchair permanently. In total, out of a population of 70 million, there is quite a large group of probably around 2 million people who may have difficulties to enjoy public and cultural life. And the Netherlands, of course, are not an exception. Across the globe, numbers are probably similar. Based on the recognition that in the Netherlands around 2 million individuals need to cope with some sort of an experienced impairment, of which a large group deserves measures to prevent them from being excluded from public and cultural life, we thought it is about time to assess what the state of affairs is regarding accessibility in museums for archaeology. But first we needed criteria to evaluate accessibility. And for this we looked at guidelines provided by interest groups and organizations like Iedereen. They advocate the interests of people with impairments, and we also looked at the formal rules and regulations. Now it's also important to listen to the needs of those who experience impairments and thus probably barriers to accessibility as well. In our case, these so-called experts by experience or peer mentors were people with visual and hearing or hearing impairments. Argiro contacted the VIEW and visited Hilde's House Museum with these people. She made observations and listened to the difficulties these people encountered during their museum visits and to their needs. All of this information together was the basis to compose criteria for accessibility for deaf and blind people. With these criteria, Argiro visited 6 Dutch museums on archaeology. And this is probably half of the number of museums on archaeology that we have in the Netherlands. Argiro also interviewed museum staff, from CEOs to curators to education officers. And finally, she assessed the accessibility of the websites of these organizations. This slide shows the criteria that we used for accessibility for people with a visual impairment. Now, we won't go into the details now, but it included things like sufficient lighting and large fonts, the use of a tactile guidance system, the use of braille, handheld audio devices and audio descriptions, a trained staff and the organization of special activities. And these were the criteria for accessibility for people with a hearing impairment, such as the use of sign language, subtitles or sign language in videos, having a trained staff, the organization of special activities and information on the website. For each of these 6 museums, it was evaluated if the level of accessibility for each of these criteria was low, medium or high. Now I won't go into the details of this, but more information on the methodology can be found in the thesis of Argiro, together with a motivation for the categorization and value assessment. Now we do not intend to judge or discredit the museums individually. We were interested in the overall picture, so we present the results anonymously. One museum unfortunately rejected cooperation, which implied that some elements and criteria could not be assessed because these were based on the interviews with a staff member. If we look at the criteria for accessibility, it is clear that not a single time accessibility could be considered high. Only once it was considered medium high. This was for blind people, and it related to the presence of audio tours. Argiro did not see any routing system for blind in any of these museums, while there are many good and fairly simple solutions available for this, which do not have to be extremely expensive. It was also noticed that only one staff member in these 6 museums was well informed about the United Nations Convention and the rules and regulations for accessibility. Moreover, very few staff members had been offered or could be offered to gather training in assisting visitors with impairments. And facilities for training are low or absent because many museums have limited financial resources for training and because they are very much dependent on volunteer work. Now, the websites were quite poorly accessible as well. In most cases, they hardly provide information regarding the museum's accessibility and about the facilities or services that people with disabilities can expect. To summarize the results of all 15 criteria for all 6 museums, the overall impression is that their situation is rather poor. Most museums scored a low accessibility. It must however also be stressed that Argiro found a very high willingness among staff members to assist visitors with impairments, even though the interviewees indicated that visitor numbers for people with impairments are usually still low. Now, on the basis of these on-site evaluations and the interviews, the conclusion is that the Dutch museums, those that were included in this study, have room for improvement in terms of accessibility. The fact that we have signed and implemented the United Nations resolution and installed an Equal Treatment Act may have led to improvements, but has not yet optimized the situation. As said, more details on the methodology and results can be found in the master thesis of Argiro, which we can share if anyone is interested. Just send us an email. To end this presentation, we would like to give some recommendations, or a take-home, so to speak. Our main message is that it is important to think more often in terms of accessibility if we disseminate results to the wider audience. Not only in museums. It's worth the effort to be self-critical and to reflect on what we are doing, and to think of the large number of individuals that we are unwillingly and often unconsciously excluding. Think of all the people whom we could also offer the pleasure to go to a museum, to learn about the past and to enjoy participation, if we would implement only a few adaptations, like offering special tours and including information on the website. It's not too complicated to check with experts by experience your level of accessibility and to ask for help to improve it. Sometimes solutions are simple and not very expensive. The people with whom Argiro visited the museum indicated, for instance, that it usually already makes a huge difference if museum staff members are kind, understanding and supportive. This urge to reflect and evaluate accessibility also includes us, the authors of this presentation. This presentation could probably have been improved in terms of visuals, subtitling, font and color use, etc., in order to make it more accessible. We realize we are insufficiently trained to do so, and this is something that deserves attention as well. Moreover, Argiro experiences hearing difficulties herself, and contributing to the online discussions, like with this conference, is often very difficult for her. Standard facilities like sign language or subtitling are usually not being offered. We like to stress that people with impairments have the right to be included and would like to be included, and we can all help to make this happen. Thank you so much for your attention.